Right, this talk is actually entitled The New Silk Road by Land and Sea. And that's a curious concept to many people because they never thought of a Silk Road by sea. And a few months ago, Xi Jinping, in a speech, actually not even a few months ago, in March of this year, said the following in a speech at UNESCO headquarters. In 1987, 20 exquisite pieces of coloured glazes were excavated at the underground chamber of Famen Temple in Shanxi, China. These East Roman and Islamic relics were brought into China during the Tang dynasty. Marvelling at these exotic relics, I, Xi Jinping, thought hard and concluded that as we approach the world's different civilizations, we should not limit ourselves to just admiring the exquisiteness of the objects involved. Rather, we should try to learn and appreciate the cultural significance behind them. Instead of only satisfying ourselves with their artistic presentation of people's life in the past, we should do our best to breathe new life into their inherent spirit. Since the new leadership in China has come to power, the concept of a new Silk Road has been extremely important in the construction of China's foreign policy. President Xi, in the last year, has made visits to Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan in Central Asia. His visits were particularly significant because no US president has yet visited the post-Soviet states in Central Asia. He also visited Southeast Asia, and he visited Malaysia and Indonesia, again in the last year. And then finally, he concluded these series of trips with a visit to Europe. So at one end we have China, in between the two, the North and the South Silk Road by land and by sea. On the other end we have Europe. In the course of these trips he made a number of extremely interesting speeches. They touched upon the importance of history. They touched upon the importance of business, of commerce in producing cultural interactions. They touched upon the importance of mutual understanding in order, as he put it, to avoid the clash of civilizations. He emphasized the long history of China and its interaction with Europe along the Silk Road by land and by sea. He emphasized also the spread of ideas from China to Europe along the Silk Road in history. And finally, he talked about Central Asia and Southeast Asia as bridges, not bridges that one runs across, but bridges with which one builds a deep relationship in order to connect with the other part of the entity with which one is trying to connect. By a curious coincidence, I was very honored to accept this invitation to speak tonight to talk about the New Silk Road. And by a strange coincidence, I was asked to give a speech last week in Samarkand, in the center of Uzbekistan, in the center of the New Silk Road. When I asked for visa to endorse my debit card when I went to speak in Uzbekistan, the lady said, "There's no such place." So I said, "Uzbekistan?" "No, there's no such country." And there was a country, and after a lot of spelling, she finally accepted this was a country and my visa card could be used in this non-existent place, Uzbekistan. So that is the place that I went to. And the conference was particularly interesting in view of Xi Jinping's speech about the New Silk Road by land and sea. The conference was opened by President Karimov, the president of Uzbekistan, and the conference was on the historical heritage of scientists and thinkers of the medieval East. Its role, the historical heritage, its role and significance for modern civilization. This is an extraordinary conference where the various speakers discussed the contributions of people like Al-Khwarizmi, who was the inventor of fundamental principles of algebra, including the very concept of the algorithm, which made a rather large contribution to life outside Uzbekistan. It included many other great scholars, Al-Farghani, Al-Birani, Ibn Sina, and also the extraordinary scholar Ulugh Beg, whose amazing observatory you can still see large parts of in Samarkand. He made a catalogue of 1,118 stars. At the conference also were two Chinese scholars, and their contribution discussed different aspects of what they called the astronomical Silk Road between China and Uzbekistan. And the main contribution, direction of contribution, was actually from Uzbekistan, from Ulugh Beg and his descendants, through to China, and they spoke very powerfully about that. So these were all free contributions, contributions to global civilization. There was no IP, no intellectual property, but that was a major contribution to the world, which China fully appreciates, and the Chinese scholars there spoke very movingly, and of course with great confidence and interest about. So now I want to say a few words about the topics that Xi Jinping talked about in terms of history of the Silk Road by land and sea. So first of all, the land routes across Central Asia. And I'll begin by emphasizing how far back these go, back at least to the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire. And most people know this is what the Silk Road was about, the export of silk from China, which had was the first to develop silk rearing and silk textiles, silk weaving. And this, of course, was a very important part of the Silk Road in its early days under the Roman Empire. But it was not the only thing that was exported or imported in the trade along the Silk Road. One of the most interesting exports from Central Asia was something that Central Asia for many, many centuries exported, which was horses. And the golden, the heavenly horses of Uzbekistan were exported to China. And of course, those of you who are familiar with Chinese iconography, who've been, for example, to Xi'an and the glorious archaeological museum in Xi'an, you'll know that these fabulous heavenly horses of Central Asia are central to the iconography of the Han Dynasty. So that was a little bit of the interaction between China and Central Asia and across the Central Asia to Europe, particularly to Syria, and the end point, which is Palmyra in Syria. One of the themes which I will not have time to enlarge upon in this talk is the role of government action, state action. Throughout the things I'm going to be talk about, but I will not touch on in any great detail, was the role of governments, the role of institutions, the role of Buddhist monasteries, the role of this later Islamic monasteries, the role of governments, the Mughal government in India and the trade up into Central Asia in nurturing and supporting infrastructure along the Silk Road. It was vital to its success historically and is vital to its success today. If we go forward a few hundred years to the Tang Dynasty, this was the period perhaps of the greatest and most intense trade between Central Asia and China. And again, it was a two-way interaction, a symbiotic interaction, not just a one-way relationship. So for example, in the Tang Dynasty, the ideas about how to raise silkworms, silk cocoons, and to make silk textiles spread, as is so often the case through trade. You can't control the spread of ideas across borders. The knowledge of how to spread and raise silk and weave textiles spread to Central Asia. And the great center of weaving in Central Asia was Bukhara. And the fabulous silks that were produced and were in advance in many ways on Chinese silks in the Tang Dynasty, 7th, 8th, 9th century. At one end of the Silk Road were used in European churches to go on their altars, and the other end were used in the Dunhuang caves, which of course were a wonderful monument of Buddhist thinking at the other end of the Silk Road. If we move forward to the Yuan Dynasty, 13th and 14th century, of course, when people think of the Mongols, they get concerned and they think about dreadful destruction and strange Hollywood films about destruction. And there was plenty of destruction. In fact, a lot of the architecture, though it is controversial, a lot of the architecture of both early Muslim, Islamic and Buddhism was destroyed by the Mongols. But it is debatable how much, because the bricks that were used in Central Asia were very friable, and so much of the destruction may not have been actually the Mongols, but may have been the use of bricks that disintegrated. It's a debate. But certainly there was a lot of destruction. But bear in mind that Marco Polo made his journey under Mongol rule, and during that period there was unity across the whole, the only time really, across Asia, from China, Central Asia to Europe. And he encountered he had a very peaceful journey across Central Asia to China. And he encountered a whole sequence of cities that were vibrant, full of commercial activity. And at one end of the Silk Road in Kashgar, he said, Kashgar has villages and towns aplenty. Its inhabitants live by trade and industry. They have fine orchards. This is in today's Xinjiang. and vineyards and flourishing estates. Cotton grows here in plenty, besides flax and hemp. The soil is fruitful and productive of all the means of life. This country is the starting point from which many merchants set out to market their wares all over the world. Now, when Kublai Khan established his capital in Beijing, as we know it today, which was then Dadu, he was looking for something beautiful to clothe, literally, his huge, immense retinue. And so he went to Bukhara in Central Asia, and the things that we now identify as the typical clothing of the Chinese court, in fact, came from Bukhara in Central Asia. So a beautiful symbiosis. Chinese technology moved to Central Asia, was improved upon, and then returned to China. So throughout this story, we find symbiosis, whether it's in court dress or in astronomy, between Central Asia and China. If we go forward to the Qing dynasty, there also was people think the Silk Road stopped at some mysterious point in the Middle Ages when sea trade began. That is not true. The Silk Road continued and indeed expanded as Russia pushed out into Central Asia, started to sell manufactured goods into Central Asia, which were then sold into China, and Chinese goods came back in return into Central Asia, back along the Silk Road. A continual story of symbiosis and deep interaction across the Silk Road by land. Well, that's enough about the Silk Road by land, an ancient place of passage, continued with fluctuations throughout 2,000 years of history. What about the Silk Road by sea, the maritime Silk Road, which Xi Jinping talked about also in his journeys? Well, the Silk Road begins in its most important segment, which is the South China Sea's Nanhai. And the Nanhai includes Guangdong, Guangxi, and Hainan provinces, Taiwan, of course, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. In his wonderful writings about the Silk Road by sea, Wang Gongwu comments as follows: the Nanhai, the southern seas, is remarkable for its near Mediterranean nature. Its main trade route from one end in the northeast to the other in the southwest lies in the path of two monsoons, and therefore is eminently suited for monsoon sailing. If we look at this extraordinary area, the Nanhai, with its Mediterranean-like characteristics, what do we find? Well, there was an ancient trade across the Nanhai, particularly by Muslim traders, and Muslim traders are a very important part of the story along the Old Silk Road and the New Silk Road. We find that this trade increased in intensity. So by the time we get from the Roman Empire onwards to the Tang dynasty and the Song dynasty in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, we find an expanding trade in silk and an expanding trade in Chinese exports of porcelain and tea. One of the reasons people think the Silk Road stopped across Central Asia is, of course, it was much cheaper to carry goods by sea, and so the volume of trade over the southern route started to surpass that over the land route, but it was not stagnant over the land route. In the South China Sea were vibrant ports trading with Chinese merchants and Muslim merchants coming in down into Southeast Asia. Cities like that many of you come from or visited: Yangzhou, Ningbo, Wenzhou, Guangzhou, and arguably the most important of these, Quanzhou, which was arguably the emporium of the world. There was a huge trade through it for several centuries, from about 1000 to 1400 AD. Recent research in Sating, Prague, is particularly interesting in understanding the Silk Road by sea. Sating Prague, which many of you may be aware of, is situated at the Isthmus of Kra, which is where the Malayan Peninsula narrows to about 70 kilometers. It wasn't there by chance. This is the place where Chinese entities are today thinking about building a canal across that 70-mile stretch. But Sating Prague, 70 kilometers wide at that point in the Malayan Peninsula, is an extremely interesting city historically. Recent archaeological research at Sating Prague, conducted by a Cambridge archaeologist, has shown the way in which the city of Sating Prague, which was an independent state, built canals across the Isthmus of Kra. This is in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th century AD. This is the place where China today is thinking about building a canal across the isthmus. And by building those canals, the rulers of Sating Prague reduced in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th century the journey from South China to South India by about 2,000 kilometers. It was an extraordinary achievement of collective action by the rulers of the city of Satin Pra. The excavations conducted recently in Satin Pra revealed in a small part of this city 50,000 shards, tiny segments of porcelain from China on the Malayan Peninsula that were deposited there 10th, 11th, 12th century. And through deep research, we could find, or it was identified, they came from particular kilns in China, Longquan, Dehua, and Jingdezhen. Most people have heard of Jingdezhen, but Longquan and Dehua were also great kilns in manufacturing porcelain in China. These were very high quality porcelains, reflecting the high level and high value added of trade from these South Chinese ports to Satin Pra and the Kra Peninsula. Chinese researchers discovered a wreck in Quanzhou, and some of you may have been there and seen it. This also was very interesting for understanding the trade. This was a wreck at the mouth of Quanzhou in China, and the wreck was preserved like underneath the mud. So a lot of things that otherwise would have died were present in the wreck, and they included something that to most people may not be that interesting, which is a large 2.4 metric ton log. So you may say, what's the point? Who cares? A log was found in Quanzhou, but it was a log of incense. And incense is very, very highly value added. And so what, again, this showed is that trade in the Nanhai involved the export of very high quality porcelains from China and the import of very high value added incenses inter alia from Southeast Asia, in this case, probably from the Malayan Peninsula, though they could have come, as you will see, from Indonesia. Huge sums were involved in this trade in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century. Another recent discovery was of a wreck north of Jakarta, 150 kilometers north of Jakarta. This is the Intan wreck, I-N-T-A-N, 10th century wreck, and this was quite recently discovered. And it was clearly on the route returning to from Guangzhou back to Java and Sumatra. On it were found, as you would expect, beautiful high-quality ceramics from China, but most interestingly, a vast weight of silver ingots. And what this shows is how deep the interaction historically between China, Java, Sumatra, and the Malayan Peninsula was over many, many hundreds of years. In the late Ming and early Qing, China was still involved in an increasing international trade in silk, in cotton textiles, and in porcelain and tea, as we all know, the most characteristic of China's exports. Recent economic research into the area of Jiangnan at the mouth of the Yangtze Delta has shown that in the 18th century, far from China being outstripped by Europe, up until very late, the research shows that the Jiangnan was the world's biggest exporter, exceeding Britain of textiles, silk and cotton. In the late 18th century, exports from South China, from Jiangnan, through the South China Seas to Europe, grew fivefold. The region had 5,000, Jiangnan, which is not that much bigger than Great Britain, had 5,000 seagoing ships in the 18th century. The tonnage was calculated to be 3 times the total tonnage of that of the entire British merchant fleet. Huge merchants participated in this trade, with sometimes fleets of more than 100 ships sailing the international seas of the South China Sea and beyond. So, some words to sum up. From the collapse of the Roman Empire up until the 18th century, China's level of commercialization, urbanization, technology and culture was far ahead of that in Europe. It was only very late in the day, after the 16th century, that Europe started to catch up. Through China's trade and cultural interaction over Central Asia and the South China Seas on into India, the Middle East and through to Europe, a long-term flow of ideas, as Xi Jinping emphasized in his speeches, took place from China to Europe. These helped to nourish the Industrial Revolution, through which Europe vaulted ahead of China in the space of only half a century. Between 1800 and 1850, the world totally changed. Through this revolution, the West, with Europe at its core, rapidly rose to dominate the whole global political economy. But this period since then is quite brief, only 200 years. The West's massive impact on the regions between it and China increasingly appear as a veneer, like a veneer of lacquer, on top of a deep, complex interaction between China over 2,000 years with both Central Asia and Southeast Asia. And that stretches back more than 2,000 years. This year, China arguably will overtake the USA as the world's largest economy. As it continues to grow in the 21st century, the evolution of its ancient, complex relationship with Central and Southeast Asia along the twin routes of the old Silk Road will become increasingly significant in global political economy. Deng Xiaoping very wisely said in a famous dictum, let's put aside our disputes and pursue common development. It's a valuable way of thinking about how to guide developments in the future along the new Silk Road by land and sea. Finally, if we look back at world history over the last 2,000 plus years, we can perhaps think of three ages. The first age was the age of contribution, the age in which Chinese culture, ideas, Buddhist culture and ideas, Muslim culture and ideas spread through trade and through cooperation without intellectual property rights, brought immense benefits to Europe and contributed very substantially, of course not exclusively, to the Industrial Revolution. The second phase, which is very brief, 200 years, we may call the age of domination, including Europe's conquest of the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and many other islands in the Pacific, by the way, which we still possess. This was the era of industrialized Europe's violent conquest and dominance of most of the world. But that era is rapidly coming to an end, and rebalancing is underway and will continue. Perhaps, and the question is a question, perhaps the next era will be the age of balance and cooperation with China, Central Asia, South and Southeast Asia, Europe, hopefully, and the US, hopefully, cooperating in a balanced multipolar world. Thank you.